Foreigner, take those to cold storage, and don't touch my reduction again.
She'd been surviving her entire life.
Who made this?
I did.
Ademi Zola.
Nobody warned Zola that the man at Table 1 had never once asked for the chef's name in 4 years of dining here. Nobody warned her that his silence was more dangerous than other men's screaming. She set the plate down without looking up. She was halfway back to the kitchen when his voice stopped the entire room. Not raised, not sharp, just inevitable, the way thunder sounds before lightning splits something you love. He said her name, both names, in a room where she'd been called nothing but the African girl for 7 months. If you've ever been invisible to people who decided your name was too much for their mouths, don't move. This one is yours. Subscribe before you're 3 minutes in, because I promise you won't want to stop. Zola Ademi had crossed 12 time zones to be laughed at. Not that she'd planned it that way. She'd come to Seoul on a James Beard scholarship and a dream that tasted like her grandmother's kitchen, smoke, palm oil, and something she could never quite name. She'd landed a position at Hiniayo, one of the most exclusive private dining establishments in Gangnam, and believed she'd finally arrived somewhere that would take her seriously. What she arrived to was Park Cheol-soo, the head chef, who called her the foreigner even after 7 months, refused to let her run a single station alone, and described her cooking as interesting, the way people say interesting when they mean strange. The waitstaff called her Zola SSI on good days, and the African girl when they thought she couldn't hear. The sous chefs let her carry the prep load and took credit for her innovations. A charcoal doenjang reduction she'd spent 3 weeks developing ended up on the menu under Park's name. Zola survived because her food was extraordinary, even when nobody said so out loud. She survived because she'd been surviving her entire life, and she survived because every third Thursday a very specific table was set with very specific attention, and whoever sat there never sent food back. She didn't know who that table belonged to until the night everything changed. It started because Park's hands were trembling. Zola noticed it the way she noticed everything in a kitchen, quietly, peripherally, while her hands were doing something else entirely. The head chef was plating a main course for Table 1, but his fingers kept shaking, small and involuntary, like a man who hadn't slept in 3 days, or a man who was afraid. "I'll take it out," she said, because the sauce was already pooling wrong and she couldn't watch good food be ruined. Park looked at her. For a moment she thought he'd refuse just to refuse. Then he stepped back, and she read something in his expression she'd never seen there before. Relief. She carried the plate herself. The dining room at Hiniayo was designed to feel like the inside of a very expensive secret. Low lighting, dark wood, the kind of silence that cost money. Most tables were occupied with the city's carefully curated elite. Zola had learned quickly not to make eye contact. She was furniture here. Furniture that cooked. She set the plate down at Table 1 without looking up, adjusted the garnish, confirmed the temperature of the side dish with 2 fingers held briefly near the bowl, turned to leave. "Who made this?" The voice was low. Not raised, not demanding. More like a statement that had shaped itself into a question out of politeness it didn't actually need. The kind of voice that expected silence from rooms. The room gave it. Zola stopped. She turned around because instinct made her, not sense. And for the first time, she looked at the man at Table 1. Ryu Tisayok was not what she'd imagined. She'd expected old. Power in Seoul's shadows had always seemed to her like something that aged men the way salt ages would. Slowly, visibly. But he was younger than she'd expected, maybe mid-30s, with the kind of face that cold weather carves out of bone. Sharp jaw, dark eyes that were completely unsettlingly still. The kind of still that wasn't peace, it was control. Everything about him was controlled. The way he held his chopsticks, the angle of his shoulders, the particular quality of his attention as it moved from the plate to her face. He was reading her. "The sous chef from Nigeria," said Manager Han, materializing at her elbow with the speed of a man trying to prevent disaster. "She assisted with preparation, but Chef Park, I asked who made this." 3 words, said without raising his voice. Manager Han stopped talking the way people stop walking when they step off an unseen curb. Zola said, "I did," because she was tired. Because she had been tired for 7 months. Because the food was hers and she was done pretending otherwise, in front of strangers who hadn't even learned her name. The man at Table 1 looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "Adami Zola." Not a question, a recognition. The room was so quiet, She could hear her own heartbeat negotiate with her lungs. "That's me," she said. He nodded once, like something had been confirmed. Then he looked back at his plate and picked up his chopsticks, and the conversation was apparently over, except that Zola's legs had momentarily forgotten what they were for. She walked back to the kitchen. Park Cheol-soo watched from behind the pass. She met his eyes, set down the serving cloth, and returned to her station without a word. She didn't sleep that night. 3 days later, Hineo's general manager called her into the office and told her she was being promoted to head of the private dining division, effective immediately. Park Cheol-soo had requested a transfer to the restaurant's Busan location. No explanation was given. None was apparently needed. Zola accepted the position because she'd earned it. She told herself the timing was coincidence. She almost believed it. The following week, she ran into Ryu T. Sayok outside the restaurant. She was carrying 2 bags of produce from the market 2 blocks away, because the morning delivery had arrived with bruised tomatoes, and Zola had opinions about bruised tomatoes. He was standing on the pavement outside a black car, speaking quietly into a phone, 2 men in dark suits at a respectful distance. She would have walked past. She was genuinely planning to walk past. He ended the call. "You walk to the market yourself," he said. "The delivery service bruises the tomatoes," she said, and then wanted to close her eyes at herself, because who says that to a man like this? Something moved at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile. Close enough to be alarming. "The doenjang reduction," he said. "How did you develop it?" Zola shifted the bags on her arms. "My grandmother used fermented locust beans in her soups. The flavor profile is similar to doenjang. I've been working on a fusion that uses both." He was quiet for a moment, considering her the way she considered a reduction, patiently, without rush, watching for the moment something revealed itself. "My grandmother was from a village in South Jiala," he said. "She made doenjang jegiji every Sunday morning. The smell used to wake me up." Zola didn't know what to do with that. It felt too human for this particular man, this particular pavement. "What was her name?" she asked, because she had apparently lost her mind entirely. "Kim Bok-soon." His face did something complicated, brief and private, like a window shutting. "She died 3 years ago. I'm sorry," Zola said, and meant it. He looked at her for another moment. Then one of the suited men murmured something, and he nodded, and just like that he was getting into the car. But before the door closed, "The market near Apgujeong has better produce. I'll have the address sent to the restaurant." The car pulled away. Zola stood on the pavement with her bruised tomatoes and a feeling she was absolutely not going to name. By the end of the week, she had the address. And a standing account at the market apparently, because when she arrived and introduced herself, the owner waved off payment with an expression that suggested arguing would be impolite. She did not think about this. She focused on her menu, her kitchen, the 40 things she needed to do before Thursday. Thursday came. He sat at table 1. She plated everything herself and sent it out with her best server and did not go to the dining room. At the end of service, the server returned with a small folded note. No envelope, no name. Inside, the broth was better than last time. What changed? Zola stared at it for a very long time. She wrote back on a napkin, because that was what was available. "I changed the water. Seoul tap water is too hard. I'm using filtered now." The server looked at the napkin, looked at her, said nothing, which was the wisest thing anyone in this building had done all month, and carried it back to the dining room. The conversations became a thing. Not scheduled, not discussed. Just occasional notes through servers, brief exchanges on the pavement, once a phone call she still wasn't entirely sure how he'd gotten her number for. He asked about her food, like someone who understood it. Not compliments exactly, observations. Specific ones. The kind that meant he was paying real attention in a way that most people who called themselves food lovers never actually did. He noticed when she changed the balance of spice. He noticed when she was tired. The seasoning was slightly off. He wrote once, "Not a criticism," and she'd had the worst morning of her month, and somehow that small observation made her feel more seen than any compliment had in years. She noticed things about him too. That he drank barley tea and not alcohol when he dined alone. That he was always early and never kept anyone waiting. That his 2 regular security men, she'd started calling them Sunday and Monday in her head, for no logical reason, were clearly fond of him even while maintaining professional distance. That he never raised his voice. That everything he wanted happened anyway. She was afraid of him still. She would have been lying otherwise. The fear was not sharp. It was more like the awareness of standing near something very large that could move unpredictably. A river. A weather system. But she was also against every sensible instinct she owned, being pulled toward him like cloth toward heat. The problem arrived on a Wednesday, in the form of a man named CEO D1. He was a food critic for one of Seoul's most read digital publications, mid-40s, charming in the practiced way of men who'd been told they were charming too many times, with the specific confidence of someone who'd spent 20 years deciding whether other people's work was worthy. He came in, ate, and sent back a request to meet the chef. Zola came out because it was her restaurant now, in all the ways that mattered. Extraordinary, he told her, with a smile that was really just eye contact held a few seconds longer than necessary. I've eaten in 40 countries, and this broth made me feel like I was somewhere entirely new. Who are you? Ademi Zola, head chef. Nigerian-American. He was writing in a small notebook, but his eyes kept coming back to her face with an attention that had nothing to do with the food. I'd love to come back, he said. Talk to you more about your process, your inspirations. A pause, precise as a knife cut, perhaps somewhere more comfortable than a dining room. Zola smiled the smile of a woman who'd been navigating versions of this conversation since she was 22. The restaurant accepts reservations online, she said pleasantly. We'd love to have you back. She walked away. What she didn't see. The third booth on the left, occupied by a man she hadn't known, was there, watching this exchange with an expression so carefully neutral it could only mean the opposite. She found out the next morning when Sunday, whose actual name she'd recently learned was Yoon Gi-T, appeared at the restaurant's back entrance with coffee and a message. The message was, Mr. Ryu would like the food critic removed from the press list. Zola stared at Gi-T. He stared pleasantly back. He was in the restaurant last night, she said, not a question. Mr. Ryu dines at Hinieo every third Thursday. And some Wednesdays, apparently. Gi-T said nothing. The coffee was very good. Tell Mr. Ryu, Zola said carefully, that I manage my own press relationships. Gi-T nodded, accepted the empty cup back, and left. An hour later, her phone lit up with a message from an unsaved number she recognized immediately. SEO D1 was removed from 3 other restaurants' press lists last year for inappropriate contact with female staff. She read it twice, then typed back. I handled it. 3 dots appeared, disappeared, appeared again. I know you did. I just wanted you to know what you were dealing with. She put the phone face down on her prep table and went back to work, but she was smiling. And her kitchen staff, wise enough to notice and too wise to comment, quietly gave her a wider berth for the rest of the morning. The review ran 2 weeks later. COD1 called Hinieo the most quietly revolutionary dining experience in Seoul and described the chef as a force of nature operating at a frequency most kitchens can't access. He did not request another private meeting. Zola suspected there were reasons for this beyond her polite refusal, but she filed the suspicion away and let the review do what reviews did. The restaurant's reservation list extended to 3 months. On the same day the piece published, Ryu T. Sayok sat at table 1 and ordered off menu. A note came through her server. Whatever you're making for yourself today. She was eating leftover jollof rice and testing a new doenjang compound butter. She sent him both, with palm nut soup she'd made that morning because her instincts said yes. The note that came back was a single line. This is what you grew up eating, she wrote back. Sunday afternoons. My grandmother's house in Lagos. His response. Teach me the recipe sometime. She held the note for a long moment, then folded it and placed it in her apron pocket, where she kept things she wasn't ready to make decisions about. The danger arrived quietly, the way real danger always does. It started with a car that parked outside the restaurant 3 evenings in a row. Zola wouldn't have noticed, but Gi-T was suddenly present at her closing time, which he hadn't been before, which made her start noticing things she might otherwise have walked past. She asked him directly. He deflected with the pleasantness of a man professionally trained to deflect. She asked again, because she was a woman who'd been underestimated her whole life and had developed a corresponding impatience with being handled gently. Gi-T looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, Mr. Ryu has some business complications, precautionary measures only. What kind of complications? The kind that don't involve you. They're parked outside my restaurant. A pause. Precautionary measures only, Chef Ademi. She wanted to push further. Something in his expression told her she'd gotten as much truth as was available here, and the rest would require asking the source directly. That evening, she called the number she'd memorized, without meaning to. He answered on the second ring. The car outside my restaurant, she said. What's happening? A brief silence. Not the silence of someone choosing a lie, but someone deciding how much truth was appropriate. There's a man named Huang Du-sik, he said finally. He has a disagreement with me. He's made it known that he intends to express that disagreement through means I find unacceptable. Unacceptable means through people close to me. The air in her apartment went very still. I'm not close to you, she said. And even as she said it, she heard the fragility in it. The way a sentence can argue against itself just by existing. Huang doesn't know the difference between association and closeness. He watches restaurants. He's watched mine. You've been seen with me. On a pavement outside a market. Twice on that pavement. Once in my car. She'd forgotten the car. He'd offered her a ride back to the restaurant after the market, and she'd accepted because it was raining, and she was carrying 12 kilos of produce. He has photographs. Zola sat down on her kitchen floor because her legs made the decision. What do you need me to do? Silence. Then, nothing. Let Gi-ti be present at closing. Change your route home. Don't go to the market alone. T-Sayok. She used his name without deciding to, and felt the slight intake of breath on the other end that told her he'd noticed. How serious is this? Serious enough that I'm telling you. A beat. Which is not something I do. She closed her eyes. Okay, she said. Okay, he echoed softly. Neither of them hung up. The jollof rice, he said eventually. The ratio of tomato to stock. How do you decide it? And just like that they were talking about food again. And the fear was still there. But it was braided now with something warmer. Something that sat under her sternum like light, inconvenient, and irrefutable. They talked for 2 hours. 3 days later, Huang Du-sik made his move. Zola was locking up the restaurant. Gi-ti was running 5 minutes late. She'd gotten a text saying so. Come back inside. Wait. But she'd already turned the key and the street was quiet, and she told herself 5 minutes was fine. It wasn't fine. They came from the side alley. 2 men, fast and professional, one with a phone showing her photograph. She didn't run because there wasn't anywhere to run, and her body chose to stop and think instead of scatter and panic, which was probably the decision that saved her, because she saw the camera above the restaurant door, and she stood directly beneath it, and she screamed, not from fear, from calculation. They grabbed her anyway. She fought, not gracefully, not with any training, just with 7 months of exhaustion and a year of grief, and every time someone had called her, the African girl turned into fuel. She got one elbow free. She bit something. She kept screaming, and then there were other sounds. Running, shouting in Korean. The men released her with the speed of people who'd suddenly made better calculations, and Gi-ti was there, and then 2 more men from Ryu T-Sayok's regular detail, and the alley was full of controlled, purposeful movement that Zola pressed her back against the wall and breathed through. It was over in under 2 minutes. Gi-ti turned to her, breathing hard. Are you hurt? No. She checked her hands, scraped palms, a bruise forming on her forearm. I'm fine. Mr. Ryu is on his way. He arrived in 4 minutes. She counted. Ryu T-Sayok stepped out of the car and crossed the distance in a way that made his security team unconsciously part for him, and he stopped in front of her, and his face, that carefully controlled, perpetually measured face, was doing something she had never seen it do. He looked terrified. I told you to wait inside, he said. I know. I told you I know. Her voice came out smaller than she intended. Something about his expression was making her eyes sting, and she refused to understand why. I was 5 minutes early. Zola. He said her name the way he'd said it that first night, and this time it sounded like something he'd been carrying for a while. He reached out, and his hands, careful and deliberate, asking permission with the slowness of the gesture, came to rest on her face, tilting her chin up, looking at her like the inventory of her safety was the only thing in the world that mattered. Are you hurt? Scraped palms, bruised arm, nothing serious. He looked at her hands. She watched something move through him like weather through glass, the kind of emotion a man like this had probably spent years learning to swallow. He was not swallowing it now. I should have... He stopped. It wasn't your fault. I should have had someone at the door, not just at close. I was... Another stop. I miscalculated. You didn't know. I should have assumed. His jaw was tight. His hands were still at her face, so carefully, and his thumbs brushed across her cheekbones, just once, like a confession he hadn't meant to make out loud. Zola's heart made a decision her brain hadn't approved. She reached up and covered his hands with hers. He went absolutely still. Come inside, she said quietly. I'll make tea. They sat in her kitchen, the restaurant kitchen, her real kitchen, while Gi-ti handled things outside and the city moved beyond the windows. She made barley tea because she knew that was what he drank, and he watched her like he'd been trying to memorize her for months and had finally been given permission. Huang, she said. What happens now? It's handled. She looked at him. He met her eyes steadily. Handled, she repeated. He won't be a problem. A pausa. I want you to know I never planned for you to be touched by this. What I do, the world I operate in, it was never supposed to reach you. But it did, yes. Something in his expression fractured, barely visible. And I'm sorry. I would take it back if I could. Zola wrapped both hands around her tea. You called me by my name, she said. The very first night. You already knew it. Yes. How? A slight hesitation. I made inquiries when the promotion was recommended. You recommended the promotion. He didn't deny it. Park Shiol-su was undermining you, he said. It was obvious. And your food. He stopped, and the way he stopped told her the next words would cost him something. Your food made me feel something I haven't felt in a very long time. Like someone had reached through everything I carry and reminded me I was still a person underneath it. He looked at his tea. I didn't intend to become... Another pause. Become what? She said softly. He looked at her. Whatever this is. The kitchen was very quiet. Zola felt the pull of him like standing too close to a fire. The fear was still there. She was honest enough to admit that. He was dangerous in ways she only partially understood. His world had put bruises on her arms. And yet, I made the reduction the first time, she said slowly, because my grandmother's soup was the last thing I cooked before she died. She passed 6 months before I came to Seoul. I was running. She hadn't told anyone that. Not here. The doenjang smelled like her kitchen. It wrecked me. I spent 3 weeks turning it into something I could use instead of something that just hurt. His eyes were on her face. She would have called you handsome, Zola added, and surprised herself into a watery laugh. She was very upfront about that. He laughed. Quietly, briefly, genuine, and it transformed his face into something she wanted to keep looking at for longer than was practical. What was her name? He asked. Adiola. It means crown of wealth, he said, and off her expression. I learned some Yoruba after you mentioned her. Zola stared at him. That's not nothing, Tisayok. No, he said quietly. It's not. Later that night, in the amber quiet of the closed kitchen, with the city humming outside and the aftermath of danger softening into something else entirely, there was a moment where they were standing by the prep counter and the space between them was about 4 inches, and neither of them had a professional reason to be that close. She looked up at him. He looked down at her. I'm afraid, she said honestly, of me, of this. She gestured between them, a small motion. Of what it costs. Your world is mine to manage, he said. You would never carry it alone. I already am. There are bruises on my arm. He flinched, a visible flinch, from a man she'd watched absorb everything else without visible reaction. He reached out and his fingers skimmed the edge of the bruise, barely touching, the lightest possible contact, and the look on his face was the most unguarded thing she had ever seen on another human being. I know, he said, and I will spend as long as it takes earning back what I failed to protect, if you'll allow it. His eyes found hers. Will you allow it? Zola looked at him for a long moment. Then she stepped the 4 inches forward and put her forehead against his chest. He went still for one breath. Then his arms came around her, careful and certain and completely unlike a man who'd never done this before. More like a man who'd been waiting to do exactly this for longer than he'd admitted to himself. She didn't think about the world outside. She just breathed. The rest could wait until morning. 2 months later, Hwang Du-sik had been quietly, permanently removed from every equation he'd been part of. Giti had become a permanent fixture at Hiniayo's evening service, which the kitchen staff accepted with the pragmatism of people given no alternative, who had also noticed he was excellent at carrying heavy produce. COD1's review had generated a waiting list stretching 5 months. 3 international food publications had reached out. Zola was fielding offers for a cookbook. She was also, on most evenings after service, sitting across from Ryu T-Sayok in her kitchen or his apartment, talking about food and history and their grandmothers and the particular weight of being raised by women who believed love was demonstrated through what you fed people. He met her kitchen staff. He learned their names, all of them, without being asked. He showed up one morning with specialty produce she'd mentioned wanting to try and helped her prep without any of the clumsiness she'd expected from a man of his particular background, which meant someone had taught him knife technique, which was a conversation she made a note to have. He was quietly, completely, devastatingly present in her life. She was terrified of what that meant. She was also done pretending she wasn't. But terror has a habit of speaking loudest at 2 a.m. one night, after a long evening of too much warmth and not enough distance. Zola lay awake staring at her ceiling, and did the math that fear always wants you to do. He was who he was. His world was what it was. She'd already been grabbed in an alley. She'd already been afraid in ways she hadn't been since she was young. And this man, this quiet, terrifying, impossibly careful man, had still never said the words that would make any of this make sense. Not really, not plainly. So she did what she always did when pain got ahead of her. She went to work early, smiled at everyone, and started building a wall brick by careful brick. She stopped returning his notes as quickly. She was busy on the evenings he was free. She sent Geeti back at the door with tea and polite excuses. She told herself she was being sensible. She told herself this was the right call. She told herself her grandmother would agree. She cried in the walk-in freezer once, which she categorically refused to count. He noticed within 48 hours. She knew he'd noticed because Geeti arrived at the restaurant with no message, just coffee, and stood by the back entrance looking at her with the expression of a man who had been instructed not to say anything, and was struggling enormously. "He sent you," she said. "I'm just bringing coffee, Chef Adami. He sent you to see if I'm all right." Geeti looked at the coffee, looked at her. "He's not doing well," he said finally, which was clearly not what he'd been told to say. "I've worked for him for 9 years. I've never seen him." He stopped himself. "He's not doing well." Zola looked at her hands. "Tell him I'm fine," she said. "He knows you're fine," said Geeti. "That's not what he's worried about." She sent him away. She went back to her kitchen. She made soup she didn't eat. He came himself that evening. Not with security. Not with a car. Just Ryu T. Sayok on foot. At her restaurant door at 10:15 at night. After service. In a coat she'd never seen before. Looking like a man who'd left whatever armor he usually carried somewhere far behind him. Zola opened the door because she couldn't not. "You're pulling away," he said. No preamble. No performance. "I'm busy." "Zola." She leaned against the doorframe. Her heart was being unreasonable and she was furious at it. "What do you want me to say?" "I want you to say what's actually happening." "I got scared," she said. The words came out without her permission, the way honest things sometimes do late at night. "I got scared and I didn't know how to hold it, so I needed some space to figure out if I was reading this wrong. If I'd imagined—" She stopped. "You didn't imagine anything," he said. "You've never said it. Not clearly. Not in a way that means I know." He stepped closer. "That's why I'm here." His breath clouded slightly in the night air. His eyes were very direct. "I am not good at this. I was raised in a world where saying the thing out loud was a vulnerability, where naming what mattered to you gave someone else a weapon. A pausa. I know that's not an excuse. I know it cost you. I'm sorry." Zola swallowed. "You are the most important person in my life," he said. "You have been, for longer than I told you. I was afraid of what that meant, for your safety, for your freedom, for what you would have to accept by being near me." He looked at her steadily. "But I'm more afraid of you building walls I can't reach over. So I'm here, saying the thing, plainly." The pavement was quiet. The city breathed around them. "Plainly," she said softly. "I love you," he said. "Adami Zola, both names, plainly." She closed her eyes for one moment. Then she reached out and took his hand and pulled him inside, and the door closed behind them, and the city kept moving the way cities do, completely indifferent to the exact moment. Two people stop being afraid of each other and start being something else entirely. On a cold November evening, with snow just beginning outside and barley tea steaming between them, Ryu T. Sayok set a small box on her kitchen counter. Not elaborate, not theatrical. Just a man who'd spent years in a world where everything had an angle, choosing to have none. "I know what I am," he said. "I know the weight of it. I'm not asking you to pretend it doesn't exist." He looked at her steadily. "I'm asking you to let me build something different with it. Something that has you at the center of it. Something that's yours as much as mine. A breath, if you want it." Zola looked at the box. Looked at him. "You learned Yoruba," she said. "I'm still learning." She picked up the box. Inside was a ring. Understated, elegant, with a small amber stone the exact color of the barley tea they'd been drinking the night she first told him about her grandmother. "You had this made," she said. "Yes." "With this stone specifically?" "Yes." She looked at him for a long moment. "Kim Bok-soon," she said quietly, his grandmother's name. The first real thing he'd ever given her, on a pavement that felt like a different life. His breath caught. "She would have liked you," Zola said. "Adiola would have liked you too." She held out her left hand. "Ask me properly." He did. 14 months after Zola Adami walked into a kitchen where nobody knew her name, she stood in a small ceremony at a venue she'd chosen for its light, wearing a dress the color of saffron. with Giti crying quietly in the third row and her kitchen staff, filling the back and a man beside her who had called her by her real name in a room full of people who'd refused to learn it. The efficient said, "What efficient say?" Ryu Tisayak looked at her like she was everything he'd given up, believing he was allowed to have. She looked back at him like the same. When it was done, when the room was full of sound and light and everything it was supposed to be full of, he leaned down and spoke quietly against her hair. "Adami Zola." "Both names," she said, laughing softly. "Always," he said. 5 months later, on a Sunday morning that smelled like doenjang jgigi and something sweeter underneath it, Zola stood in their kitchen in the apartment that had become theirs the week the ink dried. She was making breakfast. He was at the counter, reading with the unhurried ease of a man who had dismantled most of the threats in his world and was learning, slowly and genuinely, how to enjoy the quiet. She set a small thing on the counter beside his coffee. He looked at it, looked at her. "Sunday morning," she said, because that was all she had, all she needed. He set down what he was reading, crossed to her. His hands came to her face the same way they had that night in the alley, careful and sure, and his forehead met hers, and he closed his eyes, and she felt him breathe. "Adiola," he said softly, her grandmother's name, a naming, a blessing passed forward. Zola laughed, and it came out wet, and she pressed her face into his chest, and he held her like she was the most important thing in every world he had ever operated in. Outside, Seoul moved through its Sunday. Inside their kitchen, something that had started with a plate of food and a name spoken into a silent room. A name that said, "I see you, I know you. You are not furniture, you are not the foreigner. You are Ademi Zola, and I have always known it," was still quietly, completely, irrevocably becoming everything. The cook they laughed at, the boss who called her by her name, and a love built out of fermented things, Sunday mornings, bruised tomatoes, and 2 grandmothers watching from wherever grandmothers go when they finally believe their children are safe.